Hello everyone, today we talk about the soldierly status from the 16th to the 18th century, highlighting one aspect that, if anything, we discussed already, but only in the video about the Landsknechten, connected with the traditional concept of the military case, right, and the survival of the latter, more specifically in the early part of the modern era, which, and we will explain today why, has been obviously forgotten, but because of dynamics that took place specifically during these centuries from a political and social point of view, and that sort of flattened the idea of the soldier per se, right, in its, in fact, traditional provision with one part of the Imperium, which is also connected with the concept of citizenry and the reactivation at some point of this, let's say, soldierly consideration in a political sense, but without the recover of the original hierarchical one, right? As you know, I made multiple, sounds sort of more complicated than it actually is, as you will realize now. This is definitely not the first video we made on similar topics. We talked about sort of the traditional meaning of the Renaissance. We observe, I noticed that you like, for some reason, particularly these videos. They get clicked on very much, and also the watch length is particularly extended, and I have my ideas why this could be the case, but I will keep them for myself in this video, because it's important to approach this from like as a sort of objective perspective as possible. But as I always do, I try to adapt my content to what the audience makes me, like, signals me, even indirectly, right? Primarily from a moral point of view, and I try to be up to the task, of course. So let's start from this aspect. That is the new hegemony reacquired by infantry on the Renaissance battlefield, right? This had been a big deal. We know where it started from. We talked just the other day about the Swiss. We observed that sense, what it meant to be a soldier. We're talking just about military clothing, but in a sense, the Swiss incarnate that sort of proper communal ethos that would make this sort of a warrior, people selling his their military service in abroad, right, all over Europe, also to the highest. This is also the paradox of the Swiss military, that is born as an anti-feudal force, and it actually ends up serving the most aristocratic force ever, that is the French one, effectively replacing during the Italian wars like most of a native French military and infantry fort. All right, and from there, as we will see, we talk specifically about the Swiss, then pass to, of course, the Landsknechten, etc., to the Tertio, because all this has to do with the objective requisition of a specific status of the literal file and rank soldier at this point. Now, I will not spend myself to remember more than much how the Renaissance is actually the full affirmation of the Ancien regime, and so even though there's been like half of the West that has tried to configure the first centuries of the modern era as an alleged, let's say, of a moment of alleged reacquisition of power from the side of the commoners, read Fourth Estate. Actually, this was one of the moments in history in which, in relative terms, common people had sunk to a rigid incapacity to essentially overthrow, like, the current, say, the current hierarchy. Needless to say, when we look about pre-industrial systems, we are looking at, say, a moment in which institutions were much more fragile than they actually seemed, right? In a way, that commoners do not rule even today, if anything, because we have a system of indirect democracy that is basically also the last attainable one in terms of fourth estate power and capacity. It's always like the politics that decides at a higher level. You delegate someone, but there is a much narrower restricted group that obviously must rule, also on the basis of the insights of actually the best of those greater powers within society, in relative terms, relative and individual terms, that give them like the right information, etc. And we also in the explanation of, let's say, this narrative of, oh my god, the Renaissance opened to new ideas and people were becoming freer, and that's not really what was happening. Really, this is not even to say it was happening for other countries, let's say some countries that eventually would take off later, because some of these would actually remain some of the most conservative, even later on compared to others within the same continent. So it's always like a relative statement in many ways, and it sort of contrasts heavily. And again, today we don't make that history, but with properly, in fact, the history of say national comparison, as nations at this point had began to sort of erode further the power of the older universal institutions in a very significant way. When we look at the pike squares of the Renaissance, we are looking at essentially, with the usual exception of the Swiss that, however, remained in, say, at the top just for a few generations after all, and sort of went back to their own mountains, not to have much of a military impact, as you know, in the rest of European warfare, and these soldiers were, and this was true to an extent within the same Swiss Confederacy. When you look at who really had the power within it, who could fill these troops, could supply them, etc. The richer, more developed areas, right? Not definitely the poorer highland cantons, right? Were in fact paid, and in this sense heavily controlled by the princely authority, right? By the incipiently forming states that had already existed, but now, as you know, with the modern era, we're taking sort of a stronger physiognomy. And so what you're looking at has nothing to do, like in terms of the rise of infantry, with actually a greater freedom of those individual infantrymen. If anything, the late Middle Ages, the early modern age, had gone in the diametrically opposite direction, right? So much so that, for example, like it's only when you look at the early 14th century that you can see, and we'll see this perhaps in some special, the actual victories of rustics and bourgeois. In, however, somehow a limited fringe even of Europe, often in some of the least developed areas, escaping some centripetal force in during the crisis of feudalism, right? So not really actually laying any basis for the further development of infantry. It's the same Swiss that are basically the only people that of the one of the infantry victors of the first half of the 14th century that makes it into the Renaissance into a nationally foot sort of idea of itself, because the Swiss do not really develop any other arm, right? And that's also why they're knocked out during the Italian wars, where the Spanish, the Imperials had already been sorting out some better system with combined arms, of course, that are naturally a winner against a mono-arm system. Have in fact nothing to do with the same ancestors that defeated, say, the Habsburgs at battles like Morgarten, etc., that in fact did not have any professional character, right? The real distinction that actually makes infantry at this point really a thing is how much these soldiers have become paid, properly salaried troops, right? They are soldiers for a living, and this is not due to any of their personal or communal capacity to get this done. This has to do with the massive amount of financial resources rendered available by some of the most advanced countries in Europe that, of course, did not really use, they were not fighting with, say, commoners picking their own weapon and going out there without any professional training. Under, in fact, the greatest, again, princes, the greatest powers of Europe that are essentially monarchic in nature, and they are based, in fact, on the traditional doctrine of the castes. The term caste elicits like this sort of, look, it's like India, this incredibly rigid thing. No, it's not quite what that necessarily means. There were more labile, let's say, boundaries. Some of you asked me this, and I think that there is a sort of cognitive dissonance every time I talk about this notorious reality of the estates, because it's as if we had habituated people to think that people are relevant in act rather than in potential, or at least as if the potential just by opportunities had to equate to simply, people are all alike, or they actually have the same value, and or let's say the moral and political judgment of the same is simply something like rigidly divided whenever you're trying to counter this intuition. This is not like the traditional doctrine of the cases. Has to do with the possibility of rising through the ladder, but only if you actually do it. If you don't, that hierarchy there means something extremely specific. In any case, the point I was making is that being a soldier in arms at this point depended not, again, on any level of, say, greater individual freedom, right? The aforementioned peasants and commoners of the early 14th century, but also of the previous centuries, even though less militarily effective than at this point, were much freer. Actually, I'd say that in relative terms, they were much freer in the Middle Ages than they were at this point. They were better off. Sure, you can argue, well, it's difficult depending, it depends really on which places we're talking about, etc. There is an increase in the living conditions throughout the modern era, but this does not mean that absolute growth has to do with the relative increase or decrease of political freedom, right? It has there are two, and liberty would be the better term, telling the truth from a traditional point of view, and this is especially not true at this point. You have, the peasant revolts. This had been going on from actually quite a while. What you see, for example, the German Peasants' War, we have to make a video about that, is actually like a tail strike of the same movements that had started with the crisis of the mid-14th century, and that get all invariably, radically, and bloodily repressed at a mass scale. Right? If any person who has any ABC in any trace of medieval history knows perfectly well that all this, again, sort of nonsensical hype for the peasantry that you find in pop culture, just because the average person feels hysterically threatened by standards, and so has to think that randomly, like, just being a person means to be, more than they actually are, have to make you think that, oh my god, when the peasants rebelled, it was tough, you don't have to mess with the fortress. No, they went down brutally, also nonsensically, in the sense that they did actually have some power. See, this is the beauty of tradition. They had an enormous potential. I say it as a historian, like as a medievalist specifically, the fourth estate had a very solid, concrete chance of getting its place in the European parliaments at the end of the Middle Ages. There is no doubt, right? It was the first, the second, the third. The fourth had the opportunity of doing so, and they failed clamorously, mostly because they were disorganized. They did not have really a conscience of themselves. This is hard history, like also military history. You can't pinpoint all the various and for some reason, again, I have every time, for example, I make those videos about the peasants revolts, someone does not accept this. They have to say, oh my god, look at the mess the peasants did. Yes, and then what happened? Did you skip that part? Did you just read the first page? It's like Bambi. Your mom has had to like Marge Simpson chewing the VHS not to make you see how it ends. That was the reference of with a mom shot by the hunter, nothing else. But you're trying to make it catchy, but it's real. Like, we do live in a world where you find that an actually relevant section of actually adult people believe that being average is must forcibly be so necessarily positive that they are able to twist the well-known and established historiographical reality about by the way, the massive, the oceanic history of the peasantry. This is not even to make a point against, this is not about being a right-winger. This is just like the Marxists would exemplify the same, because that's, again, our history as people. Like, we all descend from peasants, by the way. So this is not to say I don't have sympathy for it or whatever, in spite of my fourth of nobility, that in fact remains just 1/4, and so that makes you think for that matter. But the point, in fact, I want to make is different here. That is that in spite of, and we have seen it in multiple videos, the general anthropological idea of the soldier during the modern era, through also mostly literature and, in that sense, satire, and a bit like this ragamuffin, in fact, fourth estate, or also regime critical, right, side of the aisle, made like of the fact of the soldier is some scumbags, after all, like, that you may like or not like, but that's what the left usually does. Even the common criminal becomes like a relatable person that you have to deeply relate with at a human level, instead of at best putting down, at worst like traumatically, and we're talking about in terms of permanent physical injury, like disciplining to be a person. The actual status of the early modern soldier was reminiscent, as I was saying at the beginning, of a status that was actually recognized at the time as a very important one, and that also, just to make the point that these people were living in a traditional reality, and they were extremely self-aware of their own individual achievements and prerogatives, loathed the fourth estate, right? There were actually something in between, like they were just a sort of military class that drew its pride and regarding also its own identity and place in society from having escaped that disgusting condition that the peasantry lived in at this point. Essentially, most European peasants were literally, even when they were considered ideally free, somebody else's people, right? I don't know if you understand what this entails psychologically. The left is always bothering us about slavery, etc. This was not slavery. It is true, but the level of, and if you really want to be sympathetic in that sense of, at least to some aspect of that condition, the idea of being under, right? The idea of like having other people that are ruling over you because they are seen as intrinsically superior people that relegate you in a condition of psychological and material inferiority, from which essentially in these centuries you're not able to It's not that they tried, as we were saying, with dreadful results, consisting in the failure, right, of these persons as persons, because they were even just also the overwhelming majority, right? Remember when I say that every people gets exactly what they deserve always, because every government cannot succeed without the decisive majority, moral majority of the people, which means that there may not be even a moral force whatsoever in the masses, and they simply let themselves being, herded like animals, right? As it mostly happens still today. Well, this is and it's their fault, right? That's where the paranoia and the conspiracy theories start, not to accept that you're a failure of a human being. Well, this is exactly the point that I'm making. The military, we've seen this very well in the video of the Landsknechten, loathed that inferior condition from which they actually been born. I mean, they presumably felt also ashamed from the same. That first of all, you understand that here we have to recover a quite radically objective sense of the reality, the hardcore reality of a rigid divide in terms of moral, cultural, and personal superiority and inferiority as a narrative to world history in the first place. This is the normal attitude. Like, shame is the feeling of the the inferior, right? It's a well-known sort of psychological behavioral aptitudinal notion, right? When the leaders rise, you have and stall and begin to soften up and to weaken, like for example the West is doing right now. You have that sort of disgusting guilt trip, like that. You have the guilty sense, and it's actually it's the negative side of dominance in that sense. The inferior maintains instead a sort of primitive, brutal force that can be is brainless essentially. Like it's for this reason always very well exploited by the great demagogues, agitators of socialism, fascism, communism. These are fortes. They are National Socialist ideologies, born out of course, the end of the ancien regime, that is the Imperial Catholic tradition, and that, however, have on the other side, that can be, you see, the role of the Dionysian to reactivate in a military sense, like its own elevation, right? Except it's not that simple, because you have also to succeed, and that's the main problem. Is the sort of the positive side, the positive ingredient, but the other sense is shame for their own condition, because you know perfectly well where you come from, and there is nothing you can do about that, right? It's in your DNA, right? And that cannot be changed. At least traditionally can be changed, only if you have some transfigurational capacity. And sometimes the war does have, right? War traditionally has that capacity, but it's no guarantee of success. We've seen it in the video about the Landsknechten. The reason why that video is so important is that Germany is a very good example, especially in the 16th century, so at the peak, as you know, of that army, that of a mix, like of the modern and the traditional. The archaic Germany was at large still sort of asleep into a still largely feudal reality, where that sense of, again, a person, like most people being literally owned by other people, was a very concrete sort of hardcore reality. It was a world ruled by lords, right down to the little level, right? And this fragmentation had also helped the rising Habsburgs at this point, in fact, to make leverage through the Landsknechten themselves on that smaller aristocracy that at some point could be co-opted in the fort, but say that I said smaller aristocracy not in a social sense, but in a political sense in that fragmentation. So trying to actually, as you know, establish finally a unified government, by at least the meaning that unified could be, like a direct control on Germany mostly. and other parts of the empire through this elevated elements from the fourth estate that were given what had been the faculty of the empire, right? Bearing arms for a 16th century Germany is something that today we cannot understand anymore, because for us, in our incredibly modernized and secularized reality, bearing arms or having the right to join the army, for example, it's something completely normal, and we sort of, in fact, de-evaluate it for this reason. Like, I mean, people don't even see the purpose of fighting a war, right? Which is pretty disturbing as a concept in terms of civic value and worth of the same person at that point. And even owning guns is mostly just, yes, I have a right to that, but I don't really know exactly what to do with it, or how to prevent a collapse that is primarily moral, right? It's not having a gun that makes you a more capable person, right? That's why you have, radically different rates of, for example, of mass murder between countries like, for example, pick Switzerland. They're heavily armed, some of the most heavily armed peoples in the world, to say the least, and they have an incredibly low level of incidents of killings, whatever. They're excellent, and they maintain that model, right? Most of my followers are from the United States, and they know that even though, in fact, gun ownership in itself is not the problem, at least the malaise, the political and social malaise that exists in the States manifests through these means that are also guns, incidentally, in much more fragorous and bloody ways, right? So you can measure, indeed, like, I think the value of a country is put under the supreme test in the moment in which it's fighting a war, right? That obviously is always decline in different ways. I mean, one thing is fighting a war of annihilation, and another is just, I don't know, intervening here and there to do something without too much commitment, right? So you cannot use different wars for like the same absolute indicator, like a sum, as an algebraic sum. It's something more complex. In the past, like from the Romano-Germanic tradition that had survived in the civic liberty of many subjects, for example, the empire at the time and the subjects of other countries in Europe, well, the idea of bearing arms went in parallel with the idea of nobility. This is a less known, say, thought, right? It's at least normal if you have studied ancient medieval law, etc. And it's also kind of obvious if you have a military historical education. But we tend not to remember that whoever bore arms, like, was not owning an object, of course, in the most, depressive materialistic view, but it is actually meant to be politically in a condition that allows him to own a weapon and hopefully knowing how to use that. Right? And not just for that. I mean, the precondition is spiritual. The empire, the faculty of bearing arms, comes from an accomplishment of the individual, right? Hence, the incredible, say, contempt towards the, at this point, largely disarmed fourth estate. And again, I can't stress it enough. Instead, the enormous sense of pride from those few elements that were co-opted into the military, and that were provided with that capacity of wielding arms, because through the imperial, the royal medium, they had sort of won as humans in their condition, for whichever degree of virtue they possessed, that status that was meant to be transfigurational in the mere instance in which you were given that weapon. And this is, again, extremely important in this period, because we've seen that, for example, the French lost the Italian wars because they did not provide themselves with a native infantry, right? They had the Swiss that they paid a lot, but they were objectively effective, and that especially came back to Switzerland when war was over. The French aristocracy that surely had its experiences and would keep having them. We were mentioning the peasant revolts, think about the Jacquerie, think about the confessional wars, the Fronde, the French Revolution, etc. That stuff happens in France regularly, every some century, and the sense is that if there had been a class of militarized, in fact, veterans, right, and capable of bearing arms and knowing how to organize themselves in a military professional sense through the experience earned in war, they could have created enormous problems to the establishment, right? And that's also what really was a problem for France under the other aspect of the war itself, because France was dramatically advantaged in terms of demographic and agricultural resources, and if they had actually created an army of commoners, in the same numbers other peoples were doing, they would maybe have had a revolution, because the aristocratic grip was very tight, but they would have surely overwhelmed the Spanish, the Imperials. This is, again, very relevant, as we've seen, for the Landsknechten, that worked like a true union, right? They had specific rights, and eventually their officials were corrupted. By the 17th century, they weren't quite an effective force anymore, but they had gained all an attitude that is very well exemplified by their own sort of provocative clothing, but that also got down to much more actually problematic stories, such as the sack of Rome of 1527, even though we should point out that the Catholic Spanish were much worse and sort of zealous in the violence against their fellow confessionals, let's say, than the German Lutherans. And obviously the interesting thing is that the same Holy Roman Imperial soldiery, of course, accepted among the scum of the earth also the heretic Protestants. We will talk about now the subtle divide between, let's say, these were largely proletarians. Yes, it is true. They were largely fortestate, and they remained like that, except when they were an actual corps, when they were that actual military caste separated from the rest of the people in arms, such as, for example, in 1529, 2 years later, Rome, in Vienna, when the Landsknechten make it to make, also for other reasons, say, together with other factors, the Ottomans retreat from the siege of the de facto capital of the German Habsburg, that want their pay, otherwise they will literally, and they said that, exterminate the Viennese population just as atrociously as the Turks would have done, right? Because that was their mentality, an incredibly traditional mentality. This city's ours because we saved it in arms from those guys who wanted to destroy it. So this population owes us, and of course the emperor owes us in many ways. There were these instances of insubordination, etc., for that. Right, and this sense of insubordination is fascinating, and I actually studied this for the 14th century, because it's typical, for example, of the mercenary companies, and apparently the Germans were quite unruly in this regard, so that the thing continues as a sort of national tradition in these outer centuries, and there is a we could make enormous digressions just on that. I hope we will get to that point in some other video, because otherwise today we won't have time. And this enormous sense of pride, of power, of prestige, of course, made a Landsknecht as a soldier at home something different from his father, from his children, at least if he would have not entered the business, from the average commoner that was below him in the ladder. All right, the status was palpably different, and to the point that the Landsknecht at that point, as a incredibly brutal and violent veteran, skilled with weaponry, having seen it all out there, could act also as the local thug, scaring away even the same local lords that at most tried to buy these guys as essentially as their mob, all right, in that heavily privatized and sort of in fact unruly reality, right? As we will see now, it's not like the noblemen or the men-at-arms were not around, right, and would not sometimes cut these people to pieces, as after all, like a Landsknecht, like he's mostly just a pikeman. A man-at-arm is a bit of a different thing, and if you are just like in a pike square in a pitched battle, it's one thing. If you have to go into hand-to-hand combat, into like smaller engagements out there, well, beware about meeting like the a mounted guy, because it's, or even just like a men-at-arm in the first place, because that's a bit of a different story, right? It's a tough confrontation, but in general, like the elite, especially during the 16th century, still maintains some pretty hardcore, especially in the first half of the 16th century, separation and elevation from the average soldier, right? So this premise, I think, is crucial, because if you don't get or accept this, it's practically impossible for you to understand modern warfare altogether. Naturally, I'm making things digestible, but if you don't insist on certain points, you can't quite get there. And of course, like in 30 minutes, like this is how I habituate my audience to the necessary complexity of of history, at least the unavoidable time it takes to explain. Because again, it's not about the mean, it's how much you're willing to see this if nobody has ever told you. So, as we were saying before, the main divide that had changed the entire game is that now there were masses of thousands of men that were military professionals. This thing in the past had technically never happened, at least in medieval times. There had been, of course, armies of, say, 30,000 men in which, say, I don't know, you had 3,000 crossbowmen that could be professional in some way, right? But aside from the fact, or even pikemen, right? And you would be surprised by how, especially in the first half of the 14th century, and actually not in the case, in fact, of the infantry victories, how many how many professional pikemen, for example, existed, but how they were subordinated still heavily to the mounted elite, like the ultra professionals, right, of the men-at-arms, the knights, all right. And so if you make the entire math in the balance, like few thousand professional pikemen versus few thousand mounted men-at-arms is just like say goodbye to the pikemen, right? At this point, things have started to change, primarily because of, say, if you were to make a broader politological and sociological inquiry, it's about how, in fact, these estates had balanced out, how the general moral temper from the late medieval crisis had sort of stratified this order and allowed more resources concentration, more centralized control, also in terms of supplies of infrastructure, fortification building, providing artillery parks, all managed by the first three estates. The fourth one had just to put the cannon fodder, and everything went well. But down to the tactical line, the way this infantry had manifested was through the combined arms of what we would say like heavy infantry and missile, better known as pike and shot in the Renaissance context, right? And I made so many videos on the topic. I'm not going to describe what this also notoriously and intuitively is, right? And to make the long story short, cavalry had at this point, and only at this point, lost its preeminence on the battlefield, right? And it's not, in fact, before really the mid-15th century that was the case, right? The infantry victories had stopped by the mid-14th century, right? They resume 1 century later. In between, cavalry is dominant, because the heavies are per se, right? Because it's not much about the arm, but who are the people, right? During the 100 Years' War, it's not the commoners that make guys fighting dismounted. It's the same, the same men at arms that fight dismounted, that are the hegemonic arm, right? And that also do not dismount all the time. But I will not start with that story as well. The new hegemony of infantry on the battlefield put an end forever to that identification between the profession of arms and the noble condition, which had reigned for centuries in European society. This is, even before the tactical aspect, the most important one, right? Not just noblemen are the military professionals. They are the best military professionals still, right? And they will remain in charge for centuries and centuries as such. But they're not the numerically prevalent professionals in the craft of war, right? Now, in order to make their states work, they need these masses of armed proletarians that they are going themselves to train, to supply, etc., and that will organically make the entire system go, right? There was an acceptation of that order, right? It was, again, intrinsic in the self-evident condition that a person found himself in the hierarchical order. But it's still a big deal, of course, and this was noticed, that the great equestrian figure of the knight that stood against the heavenly power and could dominate from the massive mounts, and that had intimidated again the infantry for at this point a millennium, right? At this point was obliged to dismount and to fight actually on foot together with the rest of the troops. Think about the Frundsberg at the Battle of Pavia. These were men who literally, like the men at arms had always been trained in every single type of combat, right? There had never been a single type of weapon that the men at arms had not known how to master, aside from the more specific need, right, to employ it, for example, at a collective level. Say, why would you fight as a horse archer if, as every nobleman in Europe always was, because they hunted like that, when you can't much more power, as you have the means, smash into into an enemy formation like a convoi, right, and thickly packed, massively traumatizing shock tactics. This was very visually appreciated at the time. In fact, the infantry, especially the introduction of firearms, had been changing the tactical quantities, right, and dynamics accordingly, for the gradual deheroization to an extent of what had been traditionally, again, the elite. There is no doubt that the elite had lost on the battlefield, but on the battlefield only that aesthetical role, if you want. Not completely. Again, cavalry is always there, does always the same thing. And it's a paradox, because you would say, but then they had lost also politically and socially. No, again, like the reason why now they were to dismount is that the resources that they had invested themselves into training large masses of troops as military professionals had rendered obsolete their own traditional arm, right? But it still reflected that unprecedented level of control on society for which, a medieval ruler were given who knows what, right, to have an army of that kind, right, with pike and shock tactics and with that level of collective professional training to maintain an order, to have an offensive pike square, right? Reason for which, in fact, also the numbers were not that enormous, right? We tend to think that the Renaissance was the sort of military revolution that never was, and instead, like, there were, say, at times, even smaller armies than certain parts of the Middle Ages on average during the Renaissance. Much stood, in fact, in the quality, and also, and consequently, in the fact that with this sort of more specific weight, more that you could bring on the battlefield, you could act more powerfully and surgically, but you would not, in fact, arm enormous masses, say, proportionally to your own population, and so things would not be that threatening, right? Until, in fact, armies started to become bigger and bigger and bigger, read the 18th century, and things like the French Revolution as a consequence politically, right? So the picture is actually quite clear. We all know that in this magnificent Renaissance, actually, what you see in terms of quality of art, of technology, etc., is mostly the product of an elite system, right? The rest of all of it is still quite stagnating, especially in terms of quality, right? There are, it's the crisis has brought the necessity to organize more, to control a larger amount of people, right? With these, in fact, depending on you, right, and moving large quantities and of resources, and also ever more internationally around the globe. Now that the Americas had been discovered, that the circumnavigation of Africa had been achieved, and so lots of other consequences of this kind. But do not magnify this period beyond what it actually was, right? At the end of the 16th century, even a thoughtful intellectual like Montaigne, we're talking about the famous Michel de Montaigne, right? He was actually Michel Lequin, Seigneur de Montaigne, and that's the actual point. One of the most important philosophers, but actually a nobleman, sort of what the best expression of those who were in charge, especially in a charge of France, continued, in fact, to take for granted that the sacrifices endured in war were the natural counterpart of the noble privilege. He wrote the following: if one did not have to sleep on the hard ground, endured the heat of midday with all weapons on, feeding on a horse and a donkey, seeing ourselves being torn to pieces and having a ball extracted from between the bones, enduring sutures, cauterizations, and probes, how would we acquire the superiority we want to have over common men? Right? This is a very modern thought, because you see how he reasons, like, how do we acquire, how we the terms here I will not digress in the French use, but it's a sort of like we are struggling, right? This is a modern now, not a medieval or ancient elite. They starting to get fatigued themselves to maintain that superiority over the common man, and the reason again is that in that mechanism we were saying before, while the elite were ever more separated from the masses, still these masses were expanding a world, and so the product of this would be the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century, because now the disparity between a system that had successfully grown dramatically, thanks to the first three estates, now could allow one of them, namely the third, the bourgeoisie, to move the masses of the fourth, as they had gained enough power to unbalance like the foundations. And this happened not because the fourth estate, as always, is good at anything, but because in fact it had been the internal traditional order had been betrayed, by the bourgeoisie and the new ideas and essentially the the loss of awareness of the sacred in the heart of man, and again this forgetfulness that was prophesied by the ancients regarding the various ages that we're living in, right? But what is beautiful of the aforementioned Montaigne quote is the quite, in fact, physical aspect of this all. That is, if a French man at arms had read this, heard this a couple of centuries before, he would have said, and what's this? Like, it's our way of living, like getting wounded, exhausting yourself, being out there on campaign, feeling tired, etc. It's how we have always lived. It's not that 16th century warfare for the individual was something more violent than it had been in the previous centuries, right? There is also the sense we often confuse the plans. Don't think that, I don't know, getting shelled is something more scary or traumatic than being charged by a heavy cavalry, man. That's actually very difficult to compare. It's like saying, well, how do you prefer to die, being gassed or being shot with a rifle? Like, who can answer these questions? And do they actually mean anything, right, in the contexts in which they happen? So you can see surfacing that more materialistic determinism, like, oh my god, it's so tiring and exhausting to do this. And the answer would have concretely been, even to a traditionalist like this guy evidently was, like, you have to develop your own spirituality more, and essentially accepting the fact that you have to go through that if you want to rule for real, and not letting go, not giving up, right? So what you see here is rather that process of gentrification that would of weakening or softening up, that would bring the same elites eventually to go down in the 18th century, not because the traditional values would not work, but because the individual members of this estate were not enough, right? And this can't be denied. I mean, in a general sense, like I as you know, get very much into the reevaluation, in fact, of the importance of traditional beliefs until very late in time. And we see that the Crusades of up to the 18th century, figures like Prince Eugen and the general sense also of this less sort of secularized and modernized world that we mostly focus our attention of, like with Britain, France in the second modern age, and in parts of Europe that had remained much more traditional and for which everything was normal. Like, it's not that that those people had to be updated to our own standards just because we see a tiny bit of them appearing in, I don't know, in northwestern Europe at that point. Still, those very Englishmen or Frenchmen had an incredibly more rigidly conservative view than anything you see here today, right? I mean, today we accept things like divorce, just out of matters of simple, like, okay, I don't love you anymore, I'm tired, I'm bored, whatever, let's break it. But this was inconceivable up to, in fact, even a few generations ago. And so we don't understand, when we study history, how massively relevant this was. This is also not just about being ignorant of the basic ideas that moved people at the time, but also pretending that there was something strange or wrong with them, and that these people were believed like that because they were just a sort of brutes, and there was no reason why they did that except they were evil, as if, I don't know, people today were not evil or worthless, right, compared to those who lived at the time, right? And this is in part matching with today's topic because, in fact, we wanted to proletarize even those, especially 16th century pikemen, that instead had a much more superiorly proud sense of themselves, exactly to distinguish themselves from the loathed fourth estate, where they had actually elevated themselves from because of all the inferiority complexes that they had. And it was seen as a great accomplishment, right? While today incredibly spoiled people who live in the single greatest material wealth in the history of mankind just whine because they think to be oppressed and discriminated, and they thus whine because they want to parasitically depend on somebody else, which is what eventually happens because somebody's going to take you over as weak as you become. For those people to elevate themselves from the foretaste state, but this again was normal up to very few generations ago, because who does like to live in that situation? We're happy and proud and accomplished to have elevated themselves from it, right? And it was the general purpose of humanity, meaning we should all be heroes, right? And gods, not, again, humans that are not going to even transcend their own mortality and simply have this miserable life of dirt on Earth, right? In any case, going back to Montaigne's definition, this kind of prejudice, which at least in France, the nobility of the sword, the noblesse de paix, would continue to cultivate until the Revolution, had already become somewhat anachronistic in other, say, from some time in other contexts, right? Bear in mind that, again, the French were the people that maintained the most that fanatic sense of aristocratic grandeur, as we well know, which was imperial in nature, and that allowed France to be, at times, probably the only truly hegemonic power in Europe, right? But it's also a system that, again, needs to be handled, and here Montaigne is pointing that out, right? It's an enormous burden, right? Of course, the burden of society is not resting on the shoulder, even of the guy who, the pikeman that dies in the front line. It's literally the sovereigns, right? Those who have all the overwhelmingly crushing moral weight of the entire issue, right? And as you understand the narrative, and we know this just from military hierarchy, there are psychological studies about this, like we've been flipped because of we have accepted suddenly that even having a Marxian vocabulary is a normal thing. I mean, how many people think that they're proud capitalists when they don't know that capitalist is just an insult coined by the Marxist vocabulary to steal your money? Like, how dumbly anti-traditionally ignorant you can be to have fallen to these incredible laws that are actually buying and feeding on the same materialism that had, at the end of the day, brought you there. But in other countries of Europe, that level of elite militarization was also different, right? And don't confuse this with a simple dichotomy, more developed, less developed. This is evidently not the case. France was among some of the most developed countries in Europe at this point, but its form of government was different from the ones of others, right? So you can have, in fact, in the most underdeveloped parts of Europe, the most traditional view, but still not. Why? Because the establishment needed that higher level of individual toughness to resist the storms that arrived from the other side. Then there are other, there's the so-called, think about Germany or Italy, that at this point, like during the first 2 centuries, like from actually the 16th to the 18th, would become known as the so-called weak areas of Europe, even though, again, they weren't weaker than, say, the East. But they were so politically fragmented. And even though at this point in the 16th century, also Germany and Italy were really the most technologically advanced countries, they did not have the same level of military power that, in fact, people think sometimes to be associated with the technological advancement. Here also there is a difference between a scientific knowledge and the opportunity of a military application, right? all the military engineers at this point were Italian, but it's not that Italy, other than actually still being a naval superpower, had the say a single force that was updated to take over the rest of Europe, right? So this is happening often, right? Depending on in fact how much you decide to invest yourself in an actual power policy, right? But today we do not talk specifically about this. Now, the multitudes of pikemen and harquebusiers who formed the armies from the end of the 15th century were so numerous that, as we've seen, they could have never been made up of noblemen alone. Simply, there was not such a political segmentation. It mostly derived, paradoxically, from the greater relative weakness of these masses politically compared to the nobility, right? And they are not immense armies, so that even if they rebel, you can still enclose yourself into a castle and sort of holding out and mobilizing other troops to crush these guys, which is, say, what happens during the German peasant revolt and again other events. Now, and these were never classist struggles, right? They were very politically vertical, right? They had always to do with the elite being in charge. You don't have communist revolts, even though there were lots of proletarians that just by their extraction surely had those kind of ideologies of, let's say, of equality, of sort of we can't take down a nobleman, that kills levels us all. They were making counterculture as much as they why did the Protestant Reformation spread? Well, of course, because it was denying the value of works, right? And as such was essentially saying, even if you're a nobleman, you cannot attain what you think to attain by winning a place in the firmament for your military exploit, which had been like the entire point of the entire ancestral belief since prehistory. And now, like, the world has to go upside down, let's contribute to tear it down. It's just like what the French still does today, right? Tearing down civilization. And civilization, of course, not being able even to exist otherwise, because this French helps you toughening the civilizational building, right? Just you have to be to watch that, the degree by which you're able to strengthen to restructure it is not smaller than the erosion capacity of the system, that, however, in a physical sense and in a metaphysical one, is like the second principle of thermodynamics, we are going to go down. And this is what, again, the prophecies say too, that Satan has to come to rule in the world before Christ eventually takes once again over. Now, in some kind, just to explain, like, the poverty, like the misery, the patchy sort of accomplishment behind this is that in some countries, such as Spain, that also produced the toughest military of the period, where there was a very numerous and very poor rural nobility as a consequence of the Reconquista and the large militarization of, the militarization of large parts of society, right? It could become usual for a nobleman to agree to serve in the military without giving up his honor. And this is actually something that, because of the Spanish hegemony at this point in history, actually spreads, especially as an imperial custom, right? From the Spanish to the empire, you have noblemen typically serving, having have this initiation starting from from the lowest ranks as filing rank pikemen. This again started from the Spanish hidalgos, right? You know that the Spanish infantry was quite dynamic. The Spanish are, with Gonzalo de Cordoba, the ones that create properly the full pike and shot tactics. At the Battle of Cerignola, they stop with both, finally, the French heavy cavalry charge, and they are able essentially to take out the Swiss, as those were a single arm system. But they were also versatile. Think about the Rodelleros, think about this sense of flexibility and adaptability. And in part, this is because the Hidalgos, that were fundamentally more like a gentry, like when you look at the multitude of them, and they were actually poor people often, and that went to war exactly for this, like as impoverished aristocrats, because their honor called them to war, but they did not have the possibility, as we've seen now, to simply like mount on horseback and do something concrete. They would actually, in fact, contribute to thickening the lines of pikemen, right? And this was just like a honor, right? Also because these were the most powerful armies that existed out there. So there was, the tercio ideally did not even it wasn't even technically a discipline or punishments, because only the fact that you could abandon it was essentially marking you as a coward for the rest of your life, right? So the voluntary nature of this army at large was the same emblem of that moral superiority that brought these guys to find their way through the universe, like fighting and dying, even as noblemen in the very front ranks of the army, right? Everywhere the captains and foremen who supervised the infantry units were usually drawn from the nobility. This really existed since the Middle Ages. Even the infantry victories of the first half of the 14th century would have not been possible if some feudal noblemen hadn't sided with the peasantry and taught them how to line up correctly, what kind of, how to order the men within the ranks, like spotting their capacity, not capacity. Again, the countercultural version is, no, this was a proletarian revolution. They were just taking down noblemen because they were so cool, and look, they used technology, this kind of weapons that stopped cavalry, which was not a thing, because the only way to stop cavalry was always at the pike, right? Other were just bludgeoning weapons, and there wasn't nothing specifically decisive about that. It was always the nobility that nurtured this, and the myth that the noblemen did not understand, like this is the other myth, like the stupid French knights that charged those longbowmen, as if, by the way, they were stopped by the longbow and not by the men-at-arms. If the longbowmen had been out there alone, they would have been cut down as grass. Obviously not. Over and over, because they were stupid, they did not accept that there were infantrymen that stopped them. First of all, they were not stopped by infantrymen, or at least by people that were not of their own ranks, because again, there were men-at-arms stopping them physically, and just the combined arms that they used, the English used in that case with the infantry, were the same ones that actually the French used, because aside from the fact of deciding to attack mounted, and at times they would do dismounted as well, they were always supported by their own infantry, by their own missile and whatever, and everything was a much more evenly matched confrontation than ever. But we've seen it in multiple battles. Poitiers is very, very exemplificative of this. The nobility had always had the best understanding, even better than the same infantrymen, of the potential of the same infantrymen. This is notorious. Like when you study military history, you realize that every time knights charge into the infantrymen, they knew perfectly well what kind of a hellish experience it was, even when they had the upper hand. Like, it's not that at some point in history infantry was useless and a knight could simply ride over it, right? They had to take it down with great expertise, with great control, with great courage, right, and more, right? So otherwise we would have not had infantry on the battlefields in the first place. But again, the average, still today, the average person without any competence or relevance knows better, because they have watched a bunch of stupid videos on YouTube, right? And that's in fact always the same old story. There was a bit of a tension sometimes. I mean, as I just said, there wasn't a classist divide that would bring to communistic revolutions or whatever. But there was some sort of, again, mixed with the usually ideological thing, like the Catholics, the Protestants, etc. Some suspicion. Also the social level between the nobility and the, again, enlisted fourth estater. The bulk of the foot fighters were plebeians. There is no doubt about that. Doesn't matter how, as we'll see now, relatively elevated from the original fourth estate their military profession made. And this is the important thing. They were well-paid professionals, right? Especially at the beginning of the age of the pike. This is the point I want to insist on. Between the 15th and the 16th century, dominated the mercenary market by imposing their own salary conditions on at least some of the reluctant governments. Let's explain this better. We're talking mostly about the Swiss, right? We mentioned before also the Landsknechten taken Vienna as a hostage to be paid. Again, it's not that these mercenaries dominated Europe. As we know, they had a very, limited political option overall. The Swiss factually went nowhere. They had the opportunity of seizing Milan if they had not been in fact crushed at Marignano. The Landsknechten, as we've seen, they were just like one of the layers of the very stratified Holy Roman Imperial system, and they failed. Essentially, not to the benefit of the elite, in the sense that at least the emperors were had successfully established them, as you know, from the end of the 15th to the beginning of the 16th century, to counter the nobility a bit, and instead the Habsburgs in the second half of the 16th century have another collapse, right? That is parallel with the loss in power of the same Landsknechten that again are paid by the state, right? So they depend on them. They do not have a capacity to aggregate themselves as a as a movement, as a people. No, they are military professionals and nothing else. Doesn't matter how important it objectively was for them to be, right? Now, there is a noticeable similarity between the salaries of infantry. However, it is true that as soon, especially as the Swiss appear with this new tactical formula that they have also kept relatively secret by training their mountaineers in fact the Swiss valleys away from indiscreet eyes, and very well guarded in that sense by the thick cantonal spionistic system. The presence of these pike squares was again the ruin even of major feudal powers, big Burgundy, right? That was literally meant to have the best army in Europe, or at least a level of qualitative, standards that would have been superior to this bunch of, commoners, mountaineers, pretty rough people from the Swiss Confederacy, and that they were instead repeatedly crashed in a way or another by a system that was simpler but more effective, because in warfare, again, what matters is moral force, and when you have moral force, you can do the most effectively strategically punching things happen, right? Of course, when you use intelligence as well, and the Swiss were able politically, emerging to understand their potential and enacting it, but also with an immense level of risk. In any case, it's like, as we've seen, the Swiss they were not the ultimate army, right? Let's say, Western Europe was already ready to take the next step, right? There were already pretty tough armies that would have been able to take over the same Swiss. These Swiss would not be able to adapt to the combined arms tactics that pretty much everybody enacted. Also the same French used the Swiss together with their own French artillery and cavalry, so it's not like they were like the Swiss would have had to change radically their own society in order to compete with the rest of Europe. And what for? Like, they didn't have the resources anyway, and so that's why they get back to Switzerland at some point, and the rest of Europe developed instead this held military. But initially, before this update was accomplished, like objectively, at least on the market of war, these pikemen could, like not individually, always by their leaders, that were fundamentally noblemen, could negotiate their own noblemen of patrician, their own price, right? And therefore, like, becoming even quite valuable as individual troopers, because they were, like, their collective effectiveness allowed, like, even this humble infantryman that alone would have not been able to succeed, because in order to have a successful pike formation, you must have lots of pikemen, and that plus have to be drilled in that way that the Swiss for the first time were carrying out from the Middle Ages, and not just the defensive mass that had always existed, but even in much larger numbers actually in the previous medieval armies. And that so brought, like, the salaries even pretty high for the individuals. And there is a noticeable similarity, in fact, in this, let's stress this as well, like, short time, between the salaries of these infantrymen and those of cavalrymen, let's say, not necessarily knights, right? But this goes, as we will see now, it has to do with the fact that talking mostly also at this point a similar stratification of the cavalry tactical specialties, right? By the end of the 13th century in Western Europe, cavalry is all like men-at-arms. You rarely have, like, even in a very minority way, like, sort of missile. At the end of the 15th century, you have instead, for a single ultra-heavy man-at-arm that now is really like a tank, right? And that therefore needs some sort of support, because alone it's too heavy and can't operate. In fact, there are all these other lighter troopers, not just cavalrymen. This is true for the lanks, as you know, with the infantry, etc. So when you confront the prices of the mounted fighters that were mostly light horse, right, with the pikeman, you do see, of course, the pikeman has acquired in proportion a much greater value, at least, than before, right? Now, then there is a similarity. It's not like that a cavalryman cost, even the lighter type, that's, you know, less than a pikeman at all, right? So, but it's still incredibly empowering in relative terms for the individual pikeman. Hence, that for a world like the one of the end of the Middle Ages, in which the Fourth Estate had gone irremediably under, an incredibly galvanizing perspective to have acquired that level of power, right? And this, again, mostly happens for the most iconic infantrymen, the Swiss and the Landsknechten, until combined arms tactics come around. And so there it's, yes, the pike is the heavy infantry, and as we've seen, there are even noblemen that in the Spanish imperial forces are increasing the value of the pike, but not quite the value, the sentiment of the average, let's say, the average final rank soldier, as much as it had been for those initial moments of that southern German infantry, right? In fact, as we were just saying, the mid-15th century, men-at-arms could count on a salary equal to 5 times that of an infantryman, right? And any mounted fighter, even the most modest ones, such as archers, received a salary at least double that of the best-paid infantryman. This had been the case from quite a while. It was true already from, like, the 14th century, or even before. Like, crossbowmen were normally few compared to the rest of the infantry, but they were tendentially professional, semi-professional. At the time of the Italian wars, the mounted fighters, that are mostly light horses, had lower salaries than the Swiss infantrymen. And again, the thing, however, falls yet again, right? So if the Swiss mercenaries, that were really the novelty at the time, commanded such high salaries, even selling their own military service to the highest bidder against the laws of the same confederacy that initially had just tried to maintain a control on the various soldiers, and now they start selling their service abroad. This was obviously because they were the ones who had invented the new fighting techniques, and therefore they were the most trained and feared infantrymen, the ones who really made the difference on a certain part of the battlefield where they could go. Right, the Swiss were good at what they did also because they united as a people. They had a substantially large population to afford that, but it's not they were literally, as you know, employed all over Europe. All right, and over time we've seen this, like with the videos about early modern mercenaries, like they couldn't maintain the upper hand. There were other peoples that would keep being hired traditionally, especially from the fringes of Europe. That Switzerland technically was, as far as the development was concerned. So everything gets rediluted. The Swiss, at some point, go down in the market. So that the initial dominance of the Swiss does not last long. Already in the first decades of the 16th century, southern Germany has become the breeding ground of an infantry that was equally competitive on the market, the Landsknechten. They weren't hired actually just from southern Germany, there were many also from the Rhineland. The important again was to find the manpower that was like at this point like very available because of all the Renaissance crisis, the various wars, the confessional agitation. So there were many areas that were destroyed, like lots of people that remained without a house, without a job, and so the Habsburgs managed to sort of attract these individuals to restore the order, even though they are some of the people that do not understand this politically. As we were saying before, the Habsburgs would even hire Lutherans. It was not much their problem because what power did these soldiers have at the end of the day? Like if you have shortcomings, disastrous, terrifying ones like the one of Rome of 1527, then that's also quite uneventful. For the rest, it's just a mutinied army that doesn't get paid because the Habsburgs cannot afford to pay. So they had taken themselves like had bit more than they could chew, and that was reflective of the situation within the empire and the fact that the Habsburgs had become a regional power, but they had not solved the chronic political fragmentation of their immense Holy Roman Imperial domain. So after the mid-16th century, the undisputed primacy fell to the tough infantry of the Spanish tercios that at this point had fully established like the pike and shot system, so it wasn't much just about the pikemen. And they had acquired a massive reputation and experience, especially in Italy. And now where in fact the matter had been largely settled, now they would shift towards Flanders, where of course they would engage into that endless struggle, and so maintaining up like the veteran quality of their forces. Although in this case, the growing, we will see it better in another video, economic difficulties of the Spanish monarchy prevented those very veterans from obtaining salaries commensurate with their fame. hence episodes like the sack of Antwerp, for example. So even in the finest army of the time, of course, mutiny and the miserable standards of the soldiery were pretty much there, right? So it's not to say that being a soldier had, in absolute terms, this enormous advantage, right? But as we'll see now, there were some positive aspects that, again, ameliorated in a certain way the life that this man would have had to otherwise have at home, a home that could be sacked by those same soldiers that it would have not joined, right? Maybe not literally in the same country, but across Europe, as you know, with many wars and so on. So there was at least some general purpose, and the reasons across the centuries why you would be a soldier are multiple, as sort of interesting to analyze. In any case, membership in these elite units especially was not only a guarantee of good earnings. The soldier enjoyed his own social condition that was certainly modest compared to that of the medieval knight that had faded as a type of fighter, but which equally should not yet be confused with the proletarian, the mere proletarian one of the ancien regime. This is the point. These were not proper. That you can't equate the soldier to the average peasant in a social sense. The mere fact that their soldiers has, as professional soldiers, a specific status, right? You can't say that in other parts of Europe, especially in Central Eastern Europe, etc., there are, there is a medieval lifestyle surviving to some sort. There are mercenaries there, as there have always been, but they're not so numerous as in Western Europe, and even as a general, like, what's a mercenary, right? We're talking about salaried troops that are also regularly drawn from not just from abroad, right, but from at least countries that are pretty much close to one another and struggling for European dominance. So, considering all this, that again, the reason why this was going on is that the elites had, yes, withdrawn a bit from the tactical dominance on the field, but they had the full control of the armies of the state, right? So it's not like, of course, they were present, as we've seen in the ranks. The officers were always noblemen. There was this involvement even of the gentry into the properly in the pike square, but the average trooper was always some sort of step behind and yet superior above the civilian condition that is technically not even well defined at this point. It's just after the 30 Years' War that there is some sort of cultural interest in defining the boundaries between war and society in a more sort of humanitarian sense, at least what that may mean. But this is the point. This time, everywhere, soldiers, and I mean real soldiers, so the professional military, loves to consider themselves superior to peasants or artisans, and also to show off a luxury in their clothing, for example, that they had in common with gentlemen to some extent, at least. And as a contemporary observed, quote, "Every little soldier with a dry pike wants to compete in arms and clothes not only with his team leader, but with the same captain." Right, this is incredibly telling of the sense of redemption and of empowerment that came out of this profession. Right, there was a capacity to truly see themselves beyond their traditional status and competing with the same establishment. In the 16th century, in reality, the soldier could thus delude himself, because this is what it amounted to, really, into occupying a prestigious status, right? There's still much of the professional in him, with pretensions to nobility, because of the ancient idea that if you bore arms, you had sort of won them in a way, and you were let, to a degree, handling them, even though, of course, these troops were run by company commanders that were also businessmen, and that were the guys subcontracted by the actual elite, and so it's not like you were given a weapon and you were a soldier forever, right? But this is an attitude which, again, in the moment in which you are armed and active, and in some instances also insubordinated and violent towards your own bosses, let's say, you can see happening since the mercenary companies of the late Middle Ages. We will talk about the soldiers of fortune, the mercenary companies of the time, and there is something of the gentleman who draws his honor by risking his life in the service of the prince that these guys want to imitate, also because, as we've seen, they're mixed with these troops as well. They do fight next to noblemen, and in part this makes them, as we've seen, proud, but also competitive with them. For example, in the Spanish army, the señores soldados shared the same ideology of service and honor with their officers, and still in 1632, in the Battle of Lutzen, during the 30 Years' War, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus could harangue his soldiers as, quote, "my faithful and brave brothers," right? This is an unthinkable expression in the mouth of a sovereign of a later era, right? And this is not to say that Gustavus Adolphus would go to a random peasant and say, "Oh, you're my faithful and brave brother." That was just not there was an order that required these people to be fostered under the lead of the lords. But of course, they were considered, low condition for a deeply moral reason, right? Here, the idea of the faithful and brave brother with a king is the one of the ancient comitatus, is the one of the ancient war bands, is the ultimate way to spirit, to exalt, to really enamor and motivate the soldiers to commit to that greatest sacrifice that war calls the individual to. And so in this moment of conjunction between heaven and earth, between paradise and hell, these men were one. They were traditionally like being redeemed by the same leader, the same medium. They had to become one in the same will, right, to act, right? And that's why this terminology was used by the same sovereigns at this point, every once in a while, of course, because the general feeling was not so brotherly and sort of familiar. But it's definitely something that, with the removal of the great sovereigns from the battlefield, like you can see in the 18th century, for obvious security reasons that had become quite evident since the Renaissance. Think about Francis I captured Pavia, right, and almost killed actually by a Landsknecht, because he looked pretty much like any other high nobleman of France at that point, and it wasn't even quite a way. So the idea of distinguish first among equals, right? Aside from the evident status of a magnificently armed man at arms, evidently belonging to the creme de la creme, but not necessarily like being distinguished as a king. By the way, the same Gustavus Adolphus, as you know, did not have really a fortunate future in that circumstance. And in that sense, truly, the 18th century saw like an elite, especially in the most, like France was the greatest example of this historically, because it had the greatest hierarchy system established, right? So it was such an enormous system that it was more difficult to balance. The elite sort of, sclerotized. They weren't able to fix the system, and the system crumbled, right? But if you look, for example, at Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, well, you can argue that until 1919, the Ancien regime, the literal Middle Ages are alive, of course, transformed and whatever, but it's, I last year made that video about Walpurgisnacht by Meyering, which sort of highlights this mentality for exactly those years still for a country like Czechia. So much could be said about this. In fact, the 18th century, as we will see now, is something that really changes this idea, right? In fact, at that date, very little would remain of the alleged splendor of the military condition. The point I was making before regarding the idea that the Ancien regime did not establish here like a rise in the liberty of the individual, or that the rise of infantry has actually anything to do with that, because it is confirmed by the lack in individual relative value of the same soldier on the battlefield. I mean, a 15th century Swiss pikeman, say, could be just, yes, a commoner, a mountaineer, a primitive, a rough peasant, rustic, from nowhere, right? But individually was seen for the mere fact that he could pick up that weapon and challenge, say, a Burgundian knight. Not literally, because as we've seen by essence, it's always about collective mass. I made a video specifically about this. It has to do with the Confederates search in medieval Switzerland, Swiss warfare playlist. But that individually, as we've seen, still, because the armies were not that big, honestly. Again, the Renaissance armies of these years, second half of the 15th century, first half of the 16th, are not larger than the armies of the beginning of the 14th century, right? So individually still, that prorompent square was made up, as we've seen, of men that could be paid on the market of war, even higher than maybe a light cavalryman out there. Why? Because the same polities and the same society was more primitive, was less powerful, was less homogeneous, more ferruginous, and sort of inefficient. By the 18th century, when you can have armies of, hundreds of thousands of men, what's the value of a guy that just pulls a trigger and reloads the musket? Even just as a warrior, right? It's not the warrior is not the most important thing. It's the discipline that makes the thing in this larger system. But still, you must have some combative capability. I mean, there is no doubt, say, between a Native American warrior on average and like a fantassin, right? The first one would have a radically advanced individual training because he lived like a savage in the first place, and there was no other way that he could survive out there. But it was enough for the fantassin that truly was a person with massive attributes, because being under the fire of the of the mitraille similia. It's something that must be taught to you. But in terms of actual combative capacities, like the guy can just pull a trigger and shoot you down and kill down the warrior that has survived who knows how many clashes, that has refined his skills and his senses, his reflexes, etc. Boom, done, right? It's a bit like Indiana Jones style, and this is, the price that inferior cultures pay, right, for not having been able to manage the thing at a higher level. Because still, of course, also the fantassin is actually a hell of a soldier. He's a guy that can disembowel you with a bayonet, that will not hesitate to do it just by, doing it blindly, has been trained to do. He's also wild subject. Like if you look at an 18th century European, is of course a much more brutally violent person that you can't normally and aptitudinally be, and just how depowered, demasculated you have become. At this point, right? But you're not militarized, right? That's also another aspect that by the 18th century the divide between the military and the populace is intense, right? And that's the same reason why you may have a gun today, but having nothing of a soldier. I mean, I actually know adult people who believe that I have a gun, we can stop the government. How, right? That's not really how it works. Like the way you stop, the way you influence your government goes. It's a spiritual factor, right? You can think to mitigate, of course, the advance of an army by thinking to be guerrilla, but it's not that giving guns to hundreds of millions of people is going to actually prevent an invading army from taking you over in detail. Because just like the peasants of the 14th century, you haven't the palest idea of what the hell the art of war is, nor you have the means to individually comprehend that or enact that, like to the level of stopping an army, just because you have a gun at home. Not even if you make the algebraic sum of all the people who have that. That's why we have states, and that's why we have the military, and that's why we need professionals, all in a hierarchy that is able to form them efficiently like that, right? So let's be serious. And you can, again, I don't have any problem with gun ownership, but for reasons that have nothing to do with stopping an actual invasion. At least that can be an auxilium, but it's not definitely what can stand alone in that regard. This is also another interesting story we could observe, like, it's not a technologistic, deterministic issue, but you need definitely an equal force to counter an enemy that has the force to organize a professional army, right? In any case, the continuation of the hostilities, which on the hot borders of Europe, first of all, that Flanders between the Catholic world and the Protestant one, had essentially become permanent, right? It had taken away from the war that character of a short and profitable adventure that maybe one of these mercenaries back in the day had thought, like, okay, let's get into it. Because it's not really, like, war is not the worst that can happen to you, even just in a regular context. So it was increasingly clear to people that those who left for war usually never returned. There was a way of the state to consume people, to, as we've seen very often, getting rid of the scum of the earth that could not be employed, that was roaming around, that was making trouble, like into the army, and to teach them something, but in this sense turning them into soldiers for life, right? And so the few who came back, aside from the mutilated, etc., like, were, as we've seen in a recent video, broken people. And they would, in a sense, become even a burden to society that would essentially marginate them and take them out in other ways. Of course, it was not always so tragic, but the idea that, again, the military was at this point a different thing from the rest of the population, that was more like a side community that was controlled by the state and that got into the meat grinder, and the civilians didn't have much to do with it, was very different from before. Like during the 16th century, the unflattering image, which had already been circulating for some time in certain circles, especially the ecclesiastical and bourgeois one, of the soldier as a desperate man, attracted only by license and loot, and willing to this to endure a dog's life that no decent person would want to live, had sort of already was sort of new, was sort of something that actually reflected again that sort of sort of also pacifistically utopistic ideas that we often see also in Erasmus. Not so, we shouldn't be so rigid with him, but still was mocking the traditional role that these men instead felt at that time to still have as soldiers in a traditional order that could reward them. In the 18th century, instead, certain aspects of the story were even aggravated by literature, etc., but it was paradoxically like the let's say the subjection of the soldier much more to a type of discipline, a type of command. We've seen it in the video about the influence of the Protestant thought in military discipline, that had really severed these guys, had alienated them from the ultimate political purpose. And in part, it's always been true, right? As society grew more complex, it sort of posed this problem more, and that's the reason why today, like, people are sort of even more alienated from understanding anything from history, from society, from politics, and are so demilitarized as well. They are so strategically uneducated because they probably don't see the thing. Nobody has ever taught them, and the same politics has diluted at times the relevance of war, even as in its primal meaning, and what it should be in an integrated say system like the one of a civilization. And indeed, like, there is this other aspect we mentioned before, that the technological development also contributed to socially disqualifying the soldier, because the arquebus and musket were weapons that anyone could learn to use with just a few hours of training, unlike the pike that took really a long time to be used in information, right? Actually, the pike was already like the first step of that loss in value of the individual. The pikeman was not that much of a great soldier at all. Like the effect was just the one of the collective formation, but the pike was used in an incredibly primitive, unskilled way. Right, the thing that really mattered was really performing the maneuvers, knowing how to change front, make counter marches, say passing from column to battle line, etc. And that's what made the mass of the pikes, and so, but not much the individual that's relevant. Right, so this progresses on, as we were saying before. The Fantassin is ever more expendable individually, is ever less significant, right? Also, as a consequence, on the market, the bargaining power of the infantrymen waned, because more or less every power had now sort of homogenized the general, like, military systems. The art of war in Europe was ever more integrated. Europeans basically fought except in certain parts of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, pretty much in the same identical way. And the wages paid by governments, increasingly under pressure from the uncontrolled growth of military spending, were also diluting at a point the motivation of the same soldier. In fact, there were incredibly high desertion rates, famously enough. It was very much like 18th century. We'll talk more about this, maintaining the core of the army and sort of this punching force as long as it could knock the enemy out, because the larger it was, the more complicated it was to keep it together and for the state to pay it, whatever. But gradually civilization was working to make it ever more efficient. And in this, the individual gets ever smaller in comparison. At the beginning of the 16th century, the salary of a pikeman made him almost a small gentleman, as we've seen. At the end of the same century, it was lower than that of a laborer. This is, again, we've seen it well in the video about the Landsknechten. That's really like how these idea of the mercenary, of the pikeman, of this cocky guy sort of faded pretty miserably, right? The great moment of that is the end of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century especially. Already at the end of the 16th century, Europe has integrated so much its own armed forces that it sort of doesn't make even sense to think that there could be a quasi-knight wielding weapons and feeling, oh my god, this was such a great accomplishment, socially speaking. Right? This tells you even how, even throughout the same wars, the same wars in this man participated, how much Europe had changed, how much it had even exhausted part of its capacities. There was something much more adventurous and picturesque in those Reisläufer and Landsknechten. At this point, there is really not much of that. It's become, again, the war of beggars, right? And I really like to identify this jump, right? This sort of step, this ladder in the evolution of the art of war, right? And by the way, needless to say, this collapse in wages had devastating consequences on the social condition of the soldier, because enlisting was no longer a honorable profession, but the last resort rather before begging or delinquency. And the bulk of the armies was now made up of that scum that the memorable Sir John Falstaff in Shakespeare's Henry IV cynically calls, in fact, food for the dust, gunshot, the food for worms. There are lots of ups and downs naturally in military history. There are some sinusoidal trends that appear here and there, other factors entering in, and you understand how the art of war was changing accordingly, and actually increasing in power. So it's very fascinating to see how the sense of duty and of commitment even to the military service, etc., became something ever more, let's say, fideistic. It must become, because you're always, like, individually going to make less, and so it takes more to understand how much of a difference you can actually make. All right, and this is not a matter of let's say simple handling of the matter. This reacts very much culturally, socially, etc. today. Again, things do change. Like, do not see, at least unless we're talking about mass warfare, like the one we can witness nowadays in Ukraine, that degree of let's say, truly of carelessness, at least, especially from one side, for the losses sustained, and that oblige, however, the enemy to keep up with his own, right? Because this is an aspect people tend not to understand also about World War I, that became, in fact, a bit like the hallmark of, what could have we done to, prevent our people to die? Well, what for? Like, why are you 100 years later having this debate as if, your country went to war at the time for no reason? That could be, by the way, another empire taking over the world and even threatening to invade you at some point. Like, that's that's the single most nonsensical attitude that shows you how much people have been properly even important professors, right? The entire narratives being like, I don't know, the Britain should have not entered the war because what may have happened if Germany had won after all? Who cares, right? If you think that Britain would have been threatened, you're just thinking because you think about Hitler during World War II and you're obsessed with that. Well, yeah, because giving ground to Germany as a military power would have been beneficial for Britain. How, right? What are the indicators that this was a gamble that you can't do? Which just you should have predicted that, especially with an openly hostile intention. Like it's we will talk about this recently, but I mean the sense that lots of people die in a war is very often seen, say, completely in a completely decontextualized way, as far as, for example, massive offensives mean to also cause massive damage on the other side, which is something that you don't really see in unless you actually study the history of it. What do you think that certain offensives on the Western Front or on the Italian front were so repeatedly, like, not changing much on the ground, but what were they useful for? Well, they were useful for because you were inflicting enormous losses to the enemy on the other side, and at the end of the day, the system stops, right, sustaining that, and so that's how the war was, like how the outcome of the war arrived. So it's not to say that they're always evenly balanced, and so you have always to be up to that. So this entire notion, which is literally the ABC of strategy, seems to have been completely forgotten. And now the problem is, oh my god, this individual life was lost. Yes, because what other options are there? Like, seriously, and it can't be as serious as this, evidently, right? I mean, it could be even more serious depending on the scale of the engagement, but in general, right? The sense is sort of apparently lost. Let's not digress further. Today, at least I cared about this video, and I managed to make it, but I should have slept more, and I'm a bit exhausted. But it's pretty much it. Like, so we'll keep looking at this stuff, and so that's it for now. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.